Good morning, friends, and welcome to our Bible study. Last week, we talked about Genesis 15, and that chapter has all those other things. You can watch the video from last week if you forget. But I left some things for our Tuesday Bible study, which I'm just going to give the conclusions of here for anyone who is maybe only seeing the online version so they can have a complete picture of chapter 15. After God promises Abraham descendants as much as the stars are in the sky, we have this odd scene where God and Abraham make a covenant, as it is called in verse 18. The making of this covenant, it involves the cutting of animals, these various animals in half. A heifer, a ram, a she-goat, not in the correct order, mind you, and then some turtle doves and pigeons. These are the animals that Abraham is ordered to cut, and he doesn't cut the birds, and these birds of prey come down upon the carcasses. Abraham has to drive them off, and then these nightmares terrify him, and then the smoking oven and this flaming torch pass through the pieces. A rather odd experience, and we ask, why does God tell Abraham to do this? The Bible reveals for us that this is a custom of making binding promises. And in the book of Jeremiah, we have the exact same formula, and we can tell from ancient Near Eastern sources from the area and from the time period that this is kind of this, it's a symbolic way of saying that the person who's being asked to make the promise, they walk through these pieces of these dead animals, and the idea is that this will be what will happen to you if you don't keep your word. And what we ultimately find from this is that God has condescended. He's gone down to Abraham's level, in a sense, to communicate to him in a way he can understand. And this isn't uncommon for God. God does this with David relative to David's kingship, as we find it is said in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 19. But what it teaches us is a rule that faith never operates alone. Acts of obedience predicate the operations of God. I'll say that again. Acts of obedience predicate or come before or precede or are the foundation or the basis of the operations of God. Jesus puts it perhaps for us in a much simpler way. As you have forgiven your trespasses, so will your trespasses be forgiven you. We are called to a life of obedience. Obedience and faith cannot be separated. And from this we can understand, especially if this was the custom of the time, Abraham erred. He did not do it correctly. He was supposed to have also cut the birds in half for God to walk through. Why he did not, perhaps he was tired from all the labor. Abraham was old, and what this whole thing became was a picture of the future of the nation of Israel, how they would be slaves in a foreign land, oppressed. That's what the furnace passing through represents. It's a furnace of oppression, their time that they spent in Egypt. And the torch represents Jesus Christ, or the salvation of God that comes to rescue the Israelites from their bondage. The fact that not all the animals were cut shows the Israelites will not fully be able to remain in God's land. They won't fully succeed. And the birds of the prey represent the battles they're going to fight and the struggles and the difficulties. And as the nightmares came upon Abraham, that preceded the liberation, in the same way a great darkness covered Egypt with terrors in the night, the death of the firstborn, before God brought salvation to his people. So really the whole thing is this prophetic picture, and at the center of it is God's willingness to walk between these pieces. For God to take the place of man and to say, as it has been done to these animals, let it be done to me if I do not keep my word. That's kind of a quick summary of the different symbols and what's going on. We're going to move forward. If you want a comparable situation where God does something pretty much just like this and where it's also not clearly stated before what he's doing, you can find it in 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 14 to 19, where God does a similar thing to a king. He provides him this covenantal test, if you will, where he has to do these actions. But we will leave this behind and we will jump ahead to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16 is a much more straightforward passage. Unlike the previous one, we don't have all this multi-layered and complex symbolic prophecy. We have something else at view. We have kind of a complicated, in many ways, moral issue. In summary, the story is how Abraham and Sarah try to achieve God's promise by having their child, the child of promise, through the slave girl Hagar. And obviously, as it sounds, it's not a super great idea, and it doesn't work out super great. But from it, we do have a question that emerges that's very helpful to introduce now, but we won't be able to answer fully, which is, does God's law change? Does God's law change? It is a complicated question, like I said, so we won't be able to deal with it totally. But let's go into the general picture of the narrative, and let's start from there. And of course, as always, if you haven't read the passage, I encourage you to do so. You're missing out if you do not. So what occurs is Abraham's been living in the land of Canaan for about 10 years since he received the promise, and Sarah comes up to Abraham and says to him, "Hey, why don't we have the child of promise through my maid Hagar? She will be my intermediary. She will stand in my place, and her child will be as if it was my child. She'll be she'll give birth to it, but I will be the true mother of this child." Abraham, not fazed by this, and because of, I think, godly motivations on both their parts, both wanting to inherit God's promise, they make a mistake in their practical living. They agree, and it is understandable that they agree with regards to the people who live around them. Polygamy, the practice of taking another wife, even this particular practice mentioned of having a concubine to bear children in place of a full wife, so to speak, was very common in the ancient Near East, as the Bible commentator Kale spells out for us. But even though something is common among men, that doesn't mean it should be common among the people of God. John Calvin rightly observes, "And though polygamy had already prevailed among many, yet it was never left to the will of man to abrogate, to repeal, or to take away, or to ignore that divine law." To paraphrase it, just because everybody is doing it doesn't make it right. And though Sarai thought she could retain the status of wife, that this was like the legitimate way that she could, vicariously give birth through Hagar, the Bible kind of throws us a hint that it was never going to work out that way in the beginning, and that's not how God saw it either. Verse 3, throw that up there on the screen for you. "Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife." What this verse shows is Sarai, in a sense, relinquishing her status of wife and giving it to someone else. She gives away her place in the plan of God's promise. Now, the result of this action, though I think she did it out of motivations of maybe even guilt, that she was barren, that maybe she was not worthy, that she was not, who knows what was going through her mind. I don't think she did it with evil motives. She did it anyway, though, and the consequences of even a well-intentioned action, when done wrongly, are painful. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, meaning when Hagar saw, she looked with contempt on her mistress. What happened is Hagar, I think, clearly saw herself as the true inheritor of God's promise, and that Sarai deserved to be the slave girl and not her. She was the true mistress. Hagar was the one who belonged beside Abraham, who was the one God had chosen. And this obviously caused a lot of conflict, as you can imagine, a lot of bitterness in the household. I don't even want to think about how bitter it was, but it was to the point where Sarai complained to Abraham and demanded that he let her discipline Hagar, in other words, retract her position that she felt Hagar had. And Abraham, kind of meanly, rejected Hagar as his wife, rejected her having any real status, and also by extension rejected her son by saying, "Sarai, do with them as you wish. Do with them as you wish. It's in your hands to do it. They're not mine. They're not under my authority." And so, following this, the Bible says Sarai treats Hagar harshly or oppresses her. You can translate it many different ways, but no matter how you translate it, I don't think it really gives you what's going on. It's very vague, and it's intentionally vague. So it sounds to us that Sarai abused her, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It could be whatever it was that went on, that Sarai behaved well, it was within her rights, and I don't think Hagar actually left because she was being physically abused by Sarai or anything like that. I think the reason Hagar left is because she and her child were rejected by Abraham. I think that's why she left, and I think that's probably the hardest thing she had to endure. And to back this up, this is kind of what occurs. This is what God seems to address when she's run away and is hiding in the wilderness from her mistress, the angel of the Lord. He appears to her, and he says to her, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? Notice, with the way the angel addresses her, she is still in God's eyes not Abram's wife, not the rightful woman of promise, but the slave of the mistress. Hagar, slave girl. Not Hagar, wife of Abraham, slave girl of Sarai. That is how she's addressed. So he denies her the position of wife that I think Hagar wants, and that was at stake in this chapter. But the second thing, which comes from this and is the painful thing, is that she is not the inheritor of Abraham's promise. Despite the fact that Sarai and Abraham, elevator did all this stuff and that she's pregnant now, that still does not then make her able to take away Sarah's place in God's plan. But this is how big and how brilliant our God is. There isn't a limited amount of promises going around. So instead of giving away Sarah's promise, God gives Hagar a new promise. He blesses her. And so this is the third point. She receives her own promise through her obedience. She gets probably through this promise the two things that her heart really desires. And so the first is that I will so multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. That's verse 10. In other words, she'll have so many children. So Hagar probably wants children. She wants a great name. She wants all these things. And then she wants the promise of God, right? And then additional to that, he gives her something which is really powerful, which is, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be, speaking of her son now, a wild ass of a man. Now, this is the New Revised Standard Version that I've been quoting, and I think they phrase this in a way that really gets across what the text is saying to our modern ears. When the Lord answers her prayer, he says, I've given heed to your affliction. I've seen what you're going through. I know what the desire of your heart is. I know what's really causing you to suffer. It's your status as a slave. That's what's really bringing you down. Your status as a slave. So God promises her that she will be free, her children will be free, and her son, no one will be able to restrain him. No one will be able to control him. He will be free to do as he wishes. He will be a wild ass of a man. No one will be able to contain him. So she promises her children, and he promises her freedom. And so the Bible tells us that Hagar is grateful for this promise, and it's what she wanted, and she thanks that God has seen her. And then she returns home, and she submits herself to her mistress, which I can imagine was a very difficult thing, but she did it. And because of her obedience, she inherited this promise.
There's a happy land of promise over on the great beyond, where the saved of earth shall soon his glory share, where the soul...
Now, as I've hinted at before, I am not of the school of thought that Abraham and Sarah did some great evil by, bringing Hagar into this whole thing, or that they were even acting faithlessly. I really see that Abraham and Sarah, because they believed so strongly in God's promise, because they wanted it so badly, they were willing to do anything. But that's the problem. You're not supposed to be willing to do anything. You have to be willing to do what God wants. That's the only way to follow God's plan, God's path, God's will, is not to do what you want, but to submit yourself to what God wants. You see, it's not that they disbelieved. It's that they believed and lived incorrectly. So knowledge and faith have to go hand in hand. And that's really what we learn from this passage. Because in this text, God denies Abraham and Sarai's attempt to kind of weasel their way into the divine promise. And as Calvin observes, and I think rightly so, this is nothing less than defiling of the marriage bed. God does not recognize their marriage. Though the people around them, though the people of the Near East may recognize Ishmael as a rightful heir of promise because he's, descended from the slave girl of Sarai, in God's eyes, that's not how it works. God was always in favor of monogamy. And it was always through the seed of the woman, the seed of the promised woman, that redemption was to come. That's the promise God gave to Eve. So always with these narratives, yeah, Abraham is important, but Abraham doesn't come alone. There is also a wife of promise. And this is a difficult thing. I think the answer to the question I stated earlier, which is, does God's law ever change? The answer is no. It does not change. What God believed was right about marriage, what God believed was right about the way the promise should be inherited, did not change. And though Abraham and Sarai were tempted by the customs of the people around them, the people of God are not to live as the people of the world. And as a result, they reap the reward for it. And I think the Bible is actually very sympathetic to Hagar and doesn't see her as a bad person in any way, or nor does it give her really this negative promise. We have here an example of Abraham and Sarai making a mistake in their living. Perhaps Proverbs 21:19 is actually addressed to this situation. It is better to dwell in the wilderness, where Hagar found herself, than with a contentious and an angry woman. Anyways, on Tuesday, we will talk about how this connects to Galatians chapter 4, verse 21 to 31, what the story of Sarah and Hagar means for the Bible as a whole, and how St. Paul handles this passage, and what that has to do for us. But for now, let us go to our devotional. Let us go to our devotional.
Saved by the blood of the crucified one, now ransomed from sin.
In this passage, the unfaithfulness of Sarah and Abraham brought in a great problem into the patriarchal family line, which was the problem of polygamy. Abraham, as far as we know, had only one wife, just Sarah. And then when they kind of broke this, they opened some floodgates. Isaac had just Rebekah, as far as we know. But then Jacob has two wives, and this problem of multiple wives ends up plaguing the people of Israel for the whole time. And the greatest king of all, Solomon, the wisest of all, the greatest is the wrong word, fell because of this same sin. So there is this tale of caution, but what I'd rather draw attention to is not so much the morality of the act, but what happened to Sarah. See, there's two passages that apply to this story in an interesting way. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, Romans 11:29. And let me throw another verse up there. I am coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, so that no one will take your crown. These two passages seem to contradict one another. If the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, why is it that someone can take away your crown or your reward in heaven? And this is because of the relationship between faith and obedience. You see, as far as God was concerned, even though Sarah and Abraham elevated Hagar to the position of wife, Sarah's calling and Sarah's gift, Sarah's position could not be changed. It could not be taken away. It could not be altered. She was always to be the woman of promise. But because of this, she let Hagar steal her glory and steal even her limelight in the biblical text, where Hagar receives her own personal promise. She lets someone rob her of her crown, of her reward, because it's through obedience that we become possessors of the promise. But whether we obey God or not, we're still his children. He never gets tired of us. He never abandons us, no matter how disobedient we are. But there are consequences, real and tangible, to disobedience. And the problem with Sarah is that she let someone else do God's work in her life on her behalf. The Bible tells us there is only one mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ. No one else can live your faith on your behalf. Sarai's great sin was she thought that someone else could be the mother of promise and she could live through them. And this is something which threatens us as believers. We leave the holy life for those people over there, and we don't want to live it for ourselves. But to this, as to all disobedience, there is a price. And the words of Christ send us out, I think, on a very sober note. I tell you that to everyone who has, more shall be given, but from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Luke 19:26. And so I would just like to encourage us all to be not just inheritors of God's promise, not just his children, but also possessors of God's promises. People who can hold them and see them in our hands, having walked a life of obedience to God. I will see you guys on Tuesday, where we'll talk about the connection this has to Galatians. I'll throw a verse up there to reinforce what I've said for you all. Take care and have a great week.
A billion years ahead, this whole world will be nothing. There's a joy that is coming like the morning.